to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software and have more fun doing it. I'm your host, Chris Harbert, and I'm here today with James Walker, the co-founder of Curiosity Software, a company he helped found in 1995 that provides solutions for test modeling and test data automation. Welcome to Developers Who Test, James.
Yeah, thank you so much. It wasn't quite 1995. I think I was about 5 years old then. But I think we started the company in maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. So it was like 2017, 2018 was kind of when it happened. But yeah, happy to be on the podcast and looking forward to it.
Yeah, sorry about that. I thought I saw that on the LinkedIn. I must have been looking at a different number. So
no, you're good.
I love to hear how different people got started. As I've been talking to different people in the space, it's really great to hear, most of us came into test automation from some other area of software development.
Mm-hmm.
And then we found our way to test automation, and that's where we really became interested in the problem and we're really able to thrive. So I'd love to hear just how you got started with software testing.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think for me, my journey kind of started a lot in academia. So I went through kind of the classic route, did a computer science degree, then moved on to do a master's degree, and then somehow I ended up doing a PhD in data visualization. That was kind of where the journey started for me into actually learning about software, how it's built, learning about data visualization and everything around it. While I was doing that course, I met my now, sounds like we're dating, but I met my now business partner, Hugh Price. So he had a company at the time, which was called Grid Tools. And they were a startup. They were going through kind of this evolution of scaling up. And, basically they were heavily involved in this kind of test data space. So creating data for organizations, like compliance was a big thing at the time, GDPR and everything. So he invited me along at the time. He came along to our university. He gave a talk on test data and everything he was doing. We got chatting and he invited me along to come for a meeting at their offices in Oxford. That meeting went really well. And he said, hey, maybe you should come on for an internship, do a couple of months here and let's see how things go. So I was like, oh, okay, great. This sounds fantastic. And then basically that's kind of where it all happened. I did my internship. He invited me along to come and work for the company afterwards. So I was working part-time while doing my postdoc degree. And then I joined the company full-time. Grid Tools got acquired by a big American company called CA Technologies. We spent a little bit of time there. And then I went off and started my own company. I was like adamant that there was all this new technology coming out at the time, right? Automation was a big thing. I had a background in machine learning and visualization. And I just thought, you know what? Like all the technologies out there at the moment, I just don't think they're good enough. I think that we could go out, start fresh, and we could build a way better platform than every single testing tool out there at the moment. And that's kind of where the journey started. So I started a company called, at the time it was called TestFlip, which was a terrible name. Hugh went off, started a company called Curiosity Software. And his whole thing was he wanted to get into robotics, process automation. So he went off and started that. This was kind of before UiPath became a thing. And then basically
sorry to interrupt, but for those who don't know, robotic process automation is when you leverage these automation tools we use to typically replace some kind of manual process. So like a big insurance company might have a form submission process and they use a tool like Selenium to submit those forms so that they don't have to replace the legacy system. So
it's funny because so basically we went off on our separate paths and then we met at the Edinburgh Festival in Scotland. And one of our old customers, a guy called Ravi, who was working at a US bank at the time, he got in touch with us and he said, hey, if you guys, I've just joined this company. These are the problems I'm having with the testing team. I believe that you guys could build a solution in this space to help us if you joined your technologies together. So we had that meeting and then we were up in Edinburgh and we just said, hey, let's do something together and see if we can solve their problem. Maybe we'll sell some licenses along the way. And basically, that's where Curiosity Software became. Like, we ended up joining forces from there. And that's how we ended up in this space. So a lot of it was kind of chance, I guess, and good timing. But also, we had a lot of contacts. We had this network before, and that kind of got us together. And here we are 6 years later, I guess. It's kind of funny.
That's awesome. So your company, they seem to do a few different things, but in particular, what I thought was interesting is your software solutions for test data management as well as test modeling. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into what test data management is and why a company needs to have a good test data management strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, yeah, absolutely. If you look at Curiosity Software, our mission statement is to help organizations basically address their software quality challenges. We're trying to stay away from the word testing at the moment. We're very much quality focused. So one of the products we have under there is called Test Data Enterprise. And basically, if you look at a lot of the work testers and developers do at the moment, a lot of time is spent hunting for the right data they need to move forward with. So basically, we've created this platform. It has lots and lots of utilities under it. And what we're trying to do is get the right data to testers and developers that they can move forward with their jobs, right? Now, if you dig deeper into test data, there's actually lots of different approaches to generate data or to get that data available, right? So it may be that there's an organization, they have a platform which is already out there in the world, and they have some production data they have available. And they want to move that into their test and development environments. So we'll use techniques like masking, which basically takes specific columns if it's a relational database, for instance, you go into a table, a specific column, and you could say this particular column has sensitive data in. So it could be things like first names, last names, email addresses, anything that can tie back to that person or anything that you don't want your developers and testers to see. So you can mask that data and then you can move it into your production and dev. And then hopefully that's desensitized so it's compliant and anyone can use it. And it's kind of de-risked from that perspective. Our unique source, which is what we kind of specialize in, is called synthetic data generation. And that's basically where you start from scratch. You've got your schema, you've got your database, you've got your tables, you've got your columns, but you have no data inside there, right? So we'll use synthetic data generation techniques to go into that database, and we'll populate it with all the different kind of business rules and business logic inside, right? And that's kind of where we specialize. But ultimately, it's about getting data to people who need it in the organization, right? And having compliant data that isn't a risk if it ever gets spread or it leaks out into the public, right?
Yeah, I feel like test data management is one of those hidden costs of doing test automation that's often very overlooked.
Yeah.
It's absolutely essential to have the right test data. I mean, even if you're trying to manually test a QA environment, you need realistic enough data to get some kind of an idea of how that system is going to perform, how the screens are going to look. If you have short account names versus long account names, is that screen going to look correct? If you have an account that has 5 products, yeah, it performs okay. But what if it has 5,000 products? Does that same page still work? So, 100%. Test data is absolutely essential to the QA process. But depending on which approach you take of the approaches you mentioned, sometimes the solution people use is just replicate production, which more and more isn't an option anymore.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges with that approach I've seen is that, the situation you're trying to test doesn't always exist in production yet, right? So when you test a system correctly, you need to make sure that it works properly in all scenarios. If that event just hasn't occurred in your production environment yet, there won't be any test data for it, right? So that's one of the downsides to that particular approach. So I think having this blended approach makes sense. And then on the other end of it, I've seen I've been the developer who's sitting there just cranking out SQL statements, trying to populate test data. And, at some point you're like, hey, when do I get back to writing code? I'm sitting here writing SQL statements to try to generate test data, right? So it's nice to
Yeah.
have some other options there.
So, I mean, absolutely 100% agree with you. I mean, one of the things that we talk a lot about is data coverage. And to your point there, if you look at production data, it's actually high volume, low variant. So it's a lot of the same of the same. So when you're talking about data coverage, you're talking about all these different combinations, which you need to test with, right? You can only test as good as the data you have available to you. So if you're thinking about it from a data coverage perspective, if I want to go off and test, some kind of credit card application process, I need all of these variations of data, someone over 18, under 18, good credit history, bad credit history. And it's getting all of these things to align and having the data you need to move forward with. And you're right, that's like a hidden cost, right? Like everyone complains all the time. Testing is too slow. We can't move fast enough. Our development team is a bottleneck, blah, blah, blah. But once you start digging in, you actually realize that, these are the effects. They're not, the symptoms of what has led you to get there. And yeah, absolutely. We see that all the time in organizations, 100%.
Yeah. What do you say to the team that says, well, maybe we just shouldn't run tests that connect to the database at all? Isn't mocking good enough? Maybe we should just mock everything.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the thing is, if you mock, you still need data to do it. So, if you're mocking, an API or you're virtualizing it, whatever that is, you still have to have data for those kind of request responses, right? And you need to think, maybe you're not thinking about the data at the same level as you would inside that database, but you still have to have this element of coverage of having everything aligned there, especially when it comes to, if you look in the finance world in particular, we do a lot of business in the finance world. If you look in there and you look at some of the payment messages or things like that, they're so incredibly complicated. Like if you've just got a very simple API, it takes a few parameters, absolutely, you don't need the test data solution, right? Like that would be overkill. But when you start getting into real world enterprise systems, it gets complex really quickly. And that's where you can't just think about, just having a very simple solution. You have to start thinking deeper about coverage, having all these different combinations, business rules and everything else from it, right? So it may not be data in the sense of, that a lot of the listeners are familiar with relational databases, etc. It could be messages, it could be your kind of NoSQL stores, it could be complex CSVs, it could be anything else from it, right? Like data is a very encompassing term, I would say.
Yeah, that's an incredibly good point. One of my early jobs in my career was working at a company called Carfax, which here in the U.S. does vehicle history reports. They're actually in Europe now as well, so I don't know if you've interacted with them. But a big part of what we were doing, at least when I was there many years ago, was loading CSV files from all of the different data partners they had. So different car dealerships, service facility shops, and every file had, different column names, different fields, different formats, different delimiters. And so really a huge part of the testing was just how do we generate enough test files of all of the different formats, not just that they're sending us today, but that we think they might send us tomorrow. Things like with different date formats or different time zones and all that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that data like that is still data, and it's not just something that's sitting in Postgres or Oracle. And so that should be a good part of someone's testing strategy as well.
Yeah, I guess the other side of this as well is a lot of systems now are SaaS based. So, an organization may come and say, we have these test data challenges, but you're not dealing with the back end database because you don't have access to it, right? So it could be something like Salesforce, Dynamics 365, really popular now as a system in enterprises. You can't access the back end system. So from that perspective, the test data mechanism that you're interacting with is actually the API. And that's what's going through. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many different ways to access systems now, and test data has really moved it's moved a lot in the past decade, I would say. Before, if I look historically, what we were doing at Grid Tools and CA, it was either mainframe systems, there was a lot of work in that, or it was either relational databases. But you go through now, it's APIs, it's NoSQL stores, containerized stores, Kafka, message queues, etc. There's so much stuff out there, which is responsible ultimately for data in the organization, right? And using these systems. It's kind of crazy how everything's evolved, I think.
Cool. Yeah, well, I think that'll definitely give our listeners something to think about. Within your own organization, what types of data do you have? What formats are they in? And what are you doing to make sure you have an appropriate level of coverage for whatever approach you're taking to generating data? Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. I also wanted to chat about test modeling. So you've done some really amazing and interesting work around creating models for automated tests that can actually generate different scenarios so that people can get better coverage of their testing without having to go through on an individual basis and write those tests. Can you describe a little bit about what that is and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you look at the official term for what we do, it's called model-based testing. I think that's the worst term in the world. Like, it sounds so academic. It sounds so serious. The reality is it's just visual diagramming. So a lot of organizations now are using tools like Figma, Miro. Historically, they would use tools like Visio, etc. And really, we are the same as those tools, just we're specifically targeted at software quality, right? So, it may be that you're starting at the requirements phases, or it may be a tester's coming in, they've got a screen in front of them they need to test. And what we would say is come into where you are, draw a model, a diagram, or just a simple flow chart, right, of how that particular system works or how that particular feature should work. And then what we can do from that is we can auto-generate test cases, auto-generate test data, and we can also generate automation from it, right? Now, the big piece of this, what we found is that it's great that you can generate all these assets from it, and that's incredibly powerful by itself. But actually, where we've seen the most power at organizations is when they collaborate together to build these models. So, if you think about, this is especially true in the enterprise world, there's kind of lots of pockets of information and there's lots of silos of knowledge. So it may be that Dave over here knows about his expertise in our payment processing system, right? Susan over here, she knows about our settlement system and, all the intricacies of that. And there's like different people in teams who know a lot about different things. When you try and bring everything together and you start to think about larger end-to-end testing, it's really hard to do that, right? You need to bring together all of these knowledge, sources of knowledge, and build out almost the central source of truth of this is how everything hangs together and how it works. And what we found is the process and the exercise of modeling actually allows them to get on the same page about how a particular component or a particular system works. And what you'll often find is, before the world of COVID, people would do this in front of a whiteboard, right? You would come in, you would get a team together, you would get in front of a whiteboard, you would start scribbling and drawing lines and figuring everything out. Now teams are very dispersed, they're very remote. So we're finding that them coming into the technology, drawing the model is actually the most empowering thing of the organization. It's kind of funny how things have shifted, but also there's just so much legacy that's around as well now, right? Maybe that's the nature of it as well, I guess.
Yeah, what I love about that is, it reminds me of a few things. One is that was the dream of Cucumber, right? So when they came up with behavior-driven development, the idea was, if we give the business users a structured way of defining tests, then we can have a collaborative conversation with our end users. And we can say, in this situation, what should we do here? In that situation, what should we do there? And one of the challenges was just, the specification was still buried in a text file inside source
Mm-hmm.
control somewhere. And if you're going to meet with someone from finance and the first step is like, hey, let's all go to our Git repository and check out the feature files, and then like, let's pull up this Excel spreadsheet, or let's pull up this Word document and try to type these things out. It seemed very rudimentary. And I think, because of that, there was kind of this pipe dream that just business users are going to be able to write tests in the form of feature files, and developers won't have to do anything. And it felt like it was a good idea, but it wasn't well executed, or people had the wrong expectations about it.
Mm.
Uh, and then if you go back at an iteration before that, it was, we were using things like Fitness, which I don't know how popular Fitness became, but the idea behind Fitness was it was a wiki, and you would edit this wiki, and then whatever was in the wiki would become a test that you could then run, which was a fun tool to use. I really enjoyed using it. Encountered challenges trying to get that to scale reliably and, run thousands of tests that way. But I think all three of these things have in common this idea of an executable specification, which is where you're working with the business users to come up with what is the specification for the software. And that's actually the hard part. That's the important part.
Yeah.
It's not implementing the automated test after the user's told you what the software is supposed to do. And I know that's what a lot of us spend a lot of time on. But really, the hard part is getting someone to say in a consistent way, what are all the requirements? How do they interact with each other? What should this system do? How should it behave in these different scenarios? And what I like about your approach here is that, it gives them a very visual way of seeing where they are in the process, and then being able to collaborate on where they need to go in the process. But at the same time, you're still creating under the hood that executable specification that we can then go run off and execute to see if the system's actually doing what the business users wanted it to do. So,
100%. I think if you look at any project, right? There's people, there's process, there's tools. Actually, tools, that's kind of the easy bit. Like I would say, automation tools, whatever. It's kind of a commodity now. If you look at process, that's a bit harder. People is actually the hardest bit, right? And if there's one thing about people do not like change. Like that's like the number one thing. So I think the problem with Cucumber, like there's a few other problems around it where the definitions become very big very quickly. It's textual based, etc. But if you think about the whole mantra there, it was for business users, as you said, to come in and start writing these specifications. And if they're not writing it, it's for them to come in and understand the specifications. Now, if you look at a lot of what business analysts, product owners are doing, their world, they live inside Jira or they live inside requirements documents. They're very familiar with creating kind of user journey flows and business process models, etc. And really for us, it was how can we create something that these guys are familiar with, which is, not wildly different to what they're doing already, to help them move into this world and driving quality throughout the software development lifecycle. And I mean, if you talk to any organization now, they're using Miro or they're using some kind of tool like that in some shape or form, right? Especially the good ones. And we're just trying to move ourselves into that kind of landscape, right? And say, we're a new tool, but, it's using the language you guys are familiar with. It's all very visual and we're trying to move into your world, right? And I think that's the key. People is so hard, right? It's so difficult.
Yeah, I love that idea of meeting them where they're at, and using the tools that they use to encourage collaboration. That was one of the things that I learned, the hard way early in my career is, you can't just come to, if you're trying to bring about change within an organization, you can't just come to someone and say, I've got everything all thought out. Here's the plan. Like, we need to do it. And you hand them a document that describes everything. Even if you have the right solution, even if they know it's the right solution, the approach is flawed and no one's going to adopt your proposal. But if you come to them with the tools that they're used to using and you say, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, how would you solve this problem? And then you use an inquisitive approach and just say like, well, what about this situation? What about that situation? You get a much better result because you get buy-in from the business user for what the end solution is going to be because they helped create that. And I think that's something that, this podcast is for developers who test and testers who develop. So a lot of our listeners are maybe 3 to 5 years into their career. And a big challenge they have is they know what the right thing is to do, but they don't know how to convince the business to do the right thing. And so this concept you're bringing to us of, use tools that are more similar to what they're used to using, and kind of meeting them where they're at, I think is critical to helping us as technologists getting better technologies in place for our customers.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting point. I mean, you must feel the same as well, right, Chris? Like you run your business, you have a team. A lot of it is all about bringing people in for the idea, and it's about coming along for the journey and everything from it, right? Like I think sales gets this like really bad like rap associated with it, right? But it's not that you're trying to sell what the direction that you kind of are, right? But like you need to bring everyone along the journey with you. If you just do everything by yourself, and as you say, this is what we're doing, X, Y, Z, it just doesn't work. It falls apart, right? It's definitely all about the journey. And I think one of the things that I've learned a lot over the past, since we've been with Curiosity over the past 6 years, is actually getting everyone involved. Like it's so empowering. Everyone has so many good ideas. Having the right team around you as well, it just helps make everything so much better, right? Like it's so much better than I would have been able to do on my own just by having everyone there who's kind of having their input and moving things forward, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even for folks who are listening to this who might say, okay, yeah, there's no way I'm going into sales. Although if you are going into sales, it really is an interesting journey. I've learned a ton about it being, I was originally a software developer, and now sales is obviously a big part of what I do. So I've learned to respect the profession quite a bit more. But in a way, we're all salespeople.
Absolutely.
Whether we're selling software to people who might benefit from that software, or we're selling our ideas to the organization because we want the organization to get better, or even if you're going into a job interview and you're trying to convince them that your personal skills and services are in alignment with the position, those are all opportunities to sell. And I think as an engineer, it's an important skill to develop to be able to learn how to problem solve, but also learn how to solve that problem in a collaborative way so that there's engagement, so that people understand why it's necessary. And ultimately, you're selling that idea, but that idea that you're selling is the better solution that needs to get in place. And so I think we could all benefit a little bit from learning more about how that all works and trying it out in the real world.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question, Chris? Just out of my interest, do you still code? Do you still develop?
I still do a little bit, not on our platform. It's kind of funny. We decided to, at one point, re-architect our platform in another language. Every now and then you want to go to a newer language or freshen things up. And I was a little on the fence about it. And then I said, you know what? I want the team to do this so that as CEO, I'm not going to be in the code base. You guys, at this point, you guys own the code base. So move it to that new framework and I'll just stay out of it. But I still do write code personally. I do that because I think it's important to stay fresh on what tools are out there, get an idea of what people are doing. But not for our platform in particular.
That's interesting. And then how do you just, I was thinking of ideas coming up to the podcast, and I just had a few questions in my head. Obviously, you guys are kind of on this journey as well. You're probably a similar size to us at the moment, I guess. There's always this trade-off between how much you want to get a feature out there and the amount of time you're going to invest testing into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We kind of eat our own dog food a little bit. We do a lot of modeling up front. We have that there. What's kind of your approach to that trade-off, and how do you find that, I guess?
Yeah, so we eat our own dog food as well. So our platform runs open source tests, typically end-to-end tests, but we can do full stack testing. And so every release of our platform, there's a version of Testry that is actually running another version of Testry.
That's
sending
cool.
us
I love
alerts
that.
based on whether or not things work.
Yeah.
I also think it's critically important to practice what you preach. And so for us that are developing platforms in the quality space, I feel like the bar is a little higher. So every time we have a defect, I take it very personally, and it's hard not to beat myself up over it. It's like, it just feels wrong to be a quality company to ship something with bugs. So we definitely care about quality. At the same time, we do also need to be pragmatic about it and know that features need to get out the door, but we want to do so the right way. And I think, that comes back to one of the biggest myths in our industry, and that's that there's a trade-off between speed and quality. If you invest in software testing, you will actually go faster. It's not a trade-off between speed and quality and how long are you spending on testing. If you write the test first, you'll get a better architected system. You'll spend less time reworking things, and it'll be more likely that it just works properly the first time, and you're always focusing on new functionality. And I've worked with some teams that spend, and they could be startups that aren't that far into their journey, but they'll spend almost 50% of their time on bugs each sprint. So half their time doing dev work, half their time working on bugs. And I've worked on other teams where, because we did test-driven development, it's more like 90% or 95% is new functionality and only 5% on bugs. And so if you think about that, the difference between 50% and 95%, that's almost like having a team that's twice as large.
Yeah.
And if you went to anyone and said, I don't care what company it is, if you go to any development company and you say, I can make your engineering team twice as big as it is, would they even be asking, could they go faster? They'd be like, no, of course I can go faster. Right. And so if you have those automated tests in place and you can get to that point where you're spending 95% of your time on new functionality and 5% on bugs instead of 50-50, there's no question you're going faster. And so I think that's the way we need to start thinking about test automation and software quality and implementing these things. Just one more thing is that I have to say this because this is a true statement. And the very first commit of the Testry platform was an automated test. So it was an integration test saying user can authenticate, and that was the very first commit for our platform. So I don't just say these things, like I mean it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that was going to be my next question. I always have this dilemma in my head. Well, it's not a dilemma, but I get asked this question a lot, especially by startup founders. Like, as soon as they hear we're in the quality space, they're like, should I be doing automation? What should my approach be? And I think I've come to the conclusion that you don't need to be over a certain size, but I feel like it doesn't slow the organization down. But if you don't have any revenue and you're starting from scratch, in my head, the biggest and best thing they could do is to go out, get a prototype together, get something working, get some user feedback, and then iterate through. And I feel like there reaches a point where then you start to think about quality, then you should start thinking about testing. So it's kind of interesting that you have you're actually proof there that you can start doing automation from the beginning, from the get-go. I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not saying like, I did everything right on the getting the business started as quickly as you possibly can and prototyping side of things. But I came out of the extreme programming world. So I was fortunate enough to, it was around mid 2000s, so maybe 2005, 2006. I was working at a company doing extreme programming by the book. When you started the job, there was a almost week-long training of how to do test-driven development. Here's why we do Agile. Here's why we do extreme programming. Here's all the practices. And, one of the core practices to extreme programming is, of course, test-driven development, but there are also things like pair programming. It's where continuous integration first started getting mentioned. So a lot of really good coding practices were really baked into that. And, because we were doing test-driven development, not a line of code went to production without first having a test to create that line of code. And when we were doing that, we were doing that all day long as developers. You were paired up with another person. It was 2 keyboards, 2 monitors, 1 computer. And one person would write the test, one person would write the code, one person would write the test, one person would write the code. And it just kind of got ingrained in you that writing the test first produces a very different result than if you run off and try to write something without the test. So, getting back to your point about, if you're very early in the startup and you're just trying to get to that prototype quickly, why would you want to write the tests? And, what I would say is, even when you're in that environment, how many times do you pull up the same screen and click on the same buttons to get to the same location on the page?
True. Yeah.
How long does it take you to figure out the reason why it's not authenticating is because of this method over here? How long does it take you to figure out when there's a bug, what section of the whole application is the bug in? And unit testing in particular, or at least, at a minimum, I think all companies should have integration tests at their API level. Like if you're making a modern application, it's so easy to get API tests in place these days. There's good tools, there's good frameworks. And I just can't imagine building an API without running an automated test, because otherwise you're like pulling up Postman or curl and you're typing at the command line, right? So it's just it's easier to write the automated tests for those. So
I think unit testing and API testing is I don't want to say it's easy, but it's definitely magnitudes simpler than going in and trying to do a full end-to-end test on any system, right? Like, I agree with you that there's no excuse there. There should be those two things there 100%. I think the other thing I've noticed a lot is that testing just has such a bad, not reputation, but testing always gets like slated in some shape or form, right? Like you're in an organization, testing's too slow. They're always finding all these problems, et cetera, et cetera. But to your point, testing is slow because there wasn't more done earlier in the life cycle, right? If you had all of your test cases created before a line of code was written, which is like ideal, that's perfection, then as soon as your developers are starting to develop, they have that acceptance criteria. They can run the test themselves. And they know that if they push that code, it's coming back to them in some shape or form if these tests don't pass, right? So it's kind of in your interest to make sure that everything is aligned and working. And then when it comes to actually testing, like maybe you've got a separate team, maybe it's all integrated in the Scrum team. Whoever's doing that testing has everything they need and they can just go straight away, right? Rather than having these information hops where you're trying to reverse engineer the requirements, figure out how it works, etc. So I think there is, doing more earlier is definitely a good thing. And I feel like there needs to be this differentiation between symptoms and causes, right? Yes, testing is slow. Yes, testing, we're finding too many defects, but that is not the cause. That's like an effect. And I think these two things just get so intertwined so quickly. And then it becomes like a cultural problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the biggest mistakes we made in software development is by treating development and testing as two separate activities.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you think of like the construction world, you have building things, and while you're building things, you're measuring things, right? You wouldn't go to someone who does construction and say, okay, I want a separate person to use the ruler and the square and make sure that everything is square, plumb, and level. And then have managers come in and say, okay, well, we want to build houses. We don't want to measure houses. So we just want to invest more in the builder side of things so that people are building houses. And we don't want them to use rulers. We don't want them to use squares or levels or anything like that. We just want them to build the house. Yeah. And so we've kind of given the decision to produce quality work away from the developers, and we've given it to managers who don't fully understand the problem of how challenging it is to build quality software quickly. And so I think, we should reclaim that power a bit and just say testing is a part of development. Now, can we still have people who specialize in APIs versus UI development, and people who specialize in test automation versus writing code? Absolutely. But I think we need to talk about software development as a thing that just has to have these pieces. Because it does. Yeah. It's just a question of who's doing the work and when, and are you handing it off to customers so that they're the ones that are testing when you ship something that's broken. So
it's interesting because, I mean, if you take your analogy there of in the construction world, building, anything, building a skyscraper or a building, whatever you're kind of building up and constructing, right? If you look at what they do there, they test at every single point possible, right? Mm-hmm. They come out with architectural diagrams which describe, the model of how this is going to look. And at that point, they start doing specific tests around, the load. What happens if there's an earthquake? Is this measurement exact? Blah, 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 blah. They're testing everything, right? And then as soon as the foundations start to get poured, there's various measurements that are happening on site to make sure the foundations are at the right level and everything else from it, right? And I think we've almost, I don't really know what happened. Like if you look at the origins, a lot of testing and the way we do testing, it's kind of come from production and assembly lines, right? It's almost this like checkbox exercise at the end. Like, does it turn on? Does it play a song? Does it look correct? Blah, blah, blah. And we've kind of just lifted and shifted those approaches into the software development landscape. Whereas to me, great, that is a component, right? But the bigger piece I think we're talking about here is more about quality. And that's much more encompassing than just running some tests at the end. Is the requirement complete? Is it unambiguous? Is it what the business or the end user is actually expecting? To your point, we're going into the development team. Let's get them the tests they need up front to run as they're going through that. And let's give them something or some kind of visual image that they know exactly what they're building and how it should work. And it's already been stress tested, etc. So we've kind of gone down this internally. We've also started talking about it at a lot of organizations now. We see testing as, we just don't like the term testing, to be honest. Like I'm almost at the point now where I would ban it internally and on any messaging, any website that we put out. I don't want to see the word testing. For us, it's all about quality. And quality is that bigger encompassing picture you're talking about there. I think testing is just one bit of the puzzle of everything that needs to align, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. So we're unfortunately running out of time here, but I really want to thank James Walker, co-founder of Curiosity Software, for a really wonderful conversation around test modeling and test data management. So thank you for coming to the program, James. Is there anything you've got coming up in the next few months we should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, good question. I mean, firstly, thank you so much, Chris. Really, really appreciate it. Over the coming months, I mean, just check out our website, curiositysoftware.ie. We've got some webinars coming up.
Thank you, James.